Welcome back to another episode of the Mainly Hoops podcast. We're back with our final SEC team preview. We've got the Kentucky Wildcats up next. Before we do dive in, if you have been enjoying our offseason content and all our other SEC team previews, please go ahead and like and subscribe. We do appreciate everyone's support. But taking a look at this Kentucky roster, a little bit different looking, obviously, compared to last year. But starting on the offensive side of the ball first here, Cody, what strengths do you see in Kentucky's offense?
Yeah, I mean, definitely a much different looking roster than last season. Last year's roster was, there were a lot of secondary guys, a lot of off-ball shooters on this roster. There was spacing really at all five positions, and this is a team that's going to have much different strengths than they had a year ago. I think I'd say the main one is just added on-ball skill and explosiveness is kind of what I had listed down, and I think they should have a really good transition attack as well. If you look at the projected starting lineup when healthy of Jalen Lowe, Otega Owe, Aberdeen, Mo Diabate, and Jaden Quaintance, it's like you have five guys that can realistically run in transition with the ball in their hands as well. So I do think like a lot of these guys like to score it at the rim as well, like to play fast. So I think that's going to fit this Mark Pope scheme perfectly. But yeah, I think this is a roster that could turn themselves into being a little bit more matchup proof as well. I think last year it was a team that struggled with more athleticism, struggled with, teams that could run them off the 3-point line at a higher level. But this is a roster that's going to be able to do a lot of different things. A lot of it is because of the depth. I think they can kind of address, a lot of different defenses in different ways. Like, you have shooting down at the, down the depths of this bench, and guys like Colin Chandler, Trent Noah, Jasper Johnson, and if Cam Williams, I think Cam Williams might start. I'm not completely sure, but I think he'd be a nice fit, just another off-ball shooter that you could bring off the bench. So I just think there's a ton of depth here, and overall, like I mentioned, like there's less off-ball shooting on this roster. I think we're going to see a lower 3-point rate, and I think this is going to be a team that will get to the rim with more frequency, and they're also going to generate free throws at a much higher clip. Last year, they were in the 29th percentile in rim rate and 113th nationally in free throw rate last season. And, like the guys I mentioned that in the starting lineup, like Lowe, Owe, and Diabate, guys like them, they love to get downhill, and I think they're going to be primary options with the ball in their hands, and I think they're going to generate a much higher free throw rate as well. And then in turn, I think, a more athletic roster, a more physical roster, I think it can also lead to, a better offensive rebound rate. Like this could be a real strength. I think it's going to depend on what Mark Pope wants to emphasize, but he has guys that can absolutely get on the glass. And again, Mo Diabate, 13% offensive rebound rate at Alabama last year, and then Jaden Quaintance as a freshman at Arizona State was 11.8%. And I think they should easily surpass their 229th offensive rebound rate mark from last season. But yeah, I just don't view this team as having like a real weakness in general. Obviously, they might be sacrificing some shooting. There could be, small concerns in like the half court fit. It's not a typical Mark Pope offense that has a ton of off ball actions being run. I mean, they're still gonna do a lot of that stuff, but it's just how effectively can they do it. But again, I think they have a lot of balance to kind of sort those things out.
Yeah, I would agree. I think first and foremost, the offensive rebounding is definitely going to be much improved with this roster, especially when Quaintance gets back. I think he'll be a real force there. And then obviously, like, you mentioned Mo Diabate. Then you've got like Brandon Garrison, who's not fantastic, but another big body. You've got Malachi Moreno, the freshman 7-footer coming in. I think there's a lot of upside for this team to be much better on the offensive glass. They were 229th last year in offensive rebound rate. I think they'll be much higher than that this year. And then to your point about last year's team, right, I think, they just became too shot-making reliant, right? We saw them live in that game against Ohio State at Madison Square Garden, and it was a prime example of like, they weren't making shots. Ohio State was running them off the line, making them put it on the deck, and they really struggled in that game. And what they lost by 20 or so. We left that game early, but I think they don't have as much of that this year. Granted, like you mentioned, there's going to be regression in the shooting department, which like it isn't necessarily a concern of mine. I mean, it's a nitpicking concern, I guess, because last year 24th in the country from three at 37.5%. Obviously, it's going to be hard to beat that with what they lost in guys like Jackson Robinson at 37%, Brea at 44, Butler at 39, Ansley Almanor at 42. All four guys really high level shooters last season for this team. And then you kind of replace that with Jalen Lowe at 26.6%. And, I know we've talked and there's probably a little bit better percentage there for him in store this year once he's back from injury. And then Denzel Aberdeen at 35% on just 103 attempts. So, I think they lost quite a lot in terms of their overall shooting, but you mentioned guys like Cam Williams, Colin Chandler down the board that could provide some shooting in this area. And then one other thing, or I guess a couple other things, like I think early in the season, especially with Lowe out, they're going to be staring at, I think, a little bit of an issue in the half court in terms of just like their creation. For others anyway, right? Like I think Otega always great, and he's looking at his career numbers, he's going to be able to get to the cup at will. Career 46% free throw rate, as you alluded to. He gets to the rim, 232 shots at the rim last year, but only a career 8.8% assist rate, right? Denzel Aberdeen, I think, is a guy who a lot more could fall on here. Same with Jasper Johnson, right? And as a freshman, it's a little bit more to ask. So I have some concerns early in the year until Lowe is back with how their half-court offense looks in terms of like who's going to be kickstarting it. And then one final thing to note, I think like a small concern would be just overall shot selection out of the guard group. I think like Otega Owe is really great at what he does, but he does like he gets to the rim more often than not, but he does settle for mid-range at times. Jalen Lowe, not a guy that shoots a ton of threes. He's more, 145 mid-range attempts last year compared to 154 threes. So, he's another guy that I think takes some shots that just analytically aren't sound in today's basketball. And then Denzel Aberdeen, I think same thing. He's a guy that low 3-point rate. He takes some tough ones too. And he's a guy like last year at Florida at times, it felt like he just kind of like would put his head down and, get into the mid range and take a tough fall away. And like, he'd make it, but you're like, man, like that's a tough one. So I think there is some potential in this guard group for just like settling for tough shots too often. But I think overall this offense is going to be fine. These are small concerns. I think that, once they're healthy, especially once they get Quaintance back, once they get Lowe back, this offense is going to be, really, really humming.
Yeah. And I mean, I think a coach like Mark Pope can kind of work some of that shot selection out of them. It's pretty heavy rim and three. I mean, he'll give you some freedom in the mid range as long as you're taking like a clean jumper in rhythm. I think he's okay with that. Like a guy like Aberdeen, he'll take some of them, but I think a lot of his game will be fanned out to the 3-point line. And, if he can shoot at 35% again on high volume, I think he'll be just fine. And then, when Jalen Lowe comes back, I'm definitely a believer in his efficiency going up, playing at Pittsburgh. Yeah, I wouldn't say he got put in the greatest situations to succeed. I mean, he was an 89% free throw shooter last season. He was a 26% 3-point shooter. You can look back to his freshman year. He shot at 35%. So I do think there's a little bit more on the bone there if he's getting cleaner looks, if he's playing with a little bit less usage. But yeah, the way I framed it was just the skill sets on this roster is far different. And I think we're going to see a different offense at times. Like just looking at last year's offense, it was an offense predicated off secondary actions and in the dribble handoff game, which was led by Amari Williams. And I'm not completely sure they have, a center that's caliber or is capable of like making plays for others at a high level. Like Williams was a pretty special passer in the 1 year that he was there. I think Garrison could do some of that stuff. I am also a believer in Mo Diabate's passing ability, just an 11% assist rate last year at Bama, but he wasn't really asked to do all that much in that offense besides offensive rebound and drive the ball to the rim. But I am a believer in him when, with a guy like Quaintance being out as well. I'm not sure. Like there's some passing ability in there. Like he's a more instinctual guy, but it's a pretty volatile game when it comes to his playmaking. So there are options there, but I do think we're going to see a little bit more primary actions. I think we're going to see a little bit more ball screen actions in pick and roll. Like last year, they were 25th percentile in pick and roll handler frequency, 23rd percentile in pick and roll man frequency, and then they were 96th percentile in handoff frequency last year and 81st percentile in cut frequency. So I don't know if we see that as much because the spacing may not be as great at the top of this roster. But like I mentioned, I think there are options to throw into the game as off-ball shooters to kind of space the floor in a half-court setting, like Chandler and Johnson and Trent Noah. But I do think it's something that may have to get worked out a little bit early in the year.
Yeah, no, I agree. And one other name before we shift to defense I wanted to just throw out there is Andrea Jelovic. Not really sure what his role is going to look like, but, from the tape appears to be, a pretty explosive guy at 6'11", a guy that can be capable of knocking down a three. It looks like last year he shot it at 32% overseas. So I think we'll see kind of what his game looks like, what his role looks like. But I think just based on the eye test from the tape, I think there is something there as a potential shooter down the board for Mark Pope. But shifting gears now to the defensive side of the ball, strengths here first, Cody. What do you see in the Kentucky defense?
Yeah, it's just a far better roster, I think, is kind of the main strength. They just upgraded in so many different areas. And, I think point of attack defense turned into a real strength after it being, a little bit dicey last year. They had good defenders in like a Lamont Butler. Obviously, they retained Otega Owe. They just didn't really have many great athletic on-ball defenders that could switch onto, if they were put at a disadvantage. I didn't really trust them all that much. I think this is a roster that can kind of switch on to anyone and be just fine. Like, I think Jalen Lowe is a solid replacement for Lamont Butler on the defensive end, just rock solid point guard defender with playmaking ability. Like I mentioned, Owe is awesome. Cam Williams on the wing had great metrics on this end a year ago. Like, I take it with a grain of salt a little bit because he played in the zone at Tulane under Ron Hunter, but the playmaking stuff was definitely there. I mean, you don't just luck your way into a 3.9% block rate as a wing and a 2.7% steal rate. So, and from what I've saw with like isolation possessions, he looked really good. He's very switchable. The athletic tools are certainly there. So I think he's going to be a plus defender in this system. And then I think the headliner on this end, like the fact that it's not Otega Owe just kind of shows how great this defense can be. I think the headliner of this defense is Mo Diabate. I think he's unbelievable on this side of the ball. Like he's not elite level rim protection, but he's able to switch 1 through 5, and I feel completely fine about any matchup that he gets. I just view him as like a Swiss Army knife on this end. He's a good rebounder, solid playmaker, guards in space against any position well. And then, I mean, the final piece, and this piece is probably the best defensive prospect and maybe in the entire country. And that's Jaden Quaintance when he gets healthy. I'm not sure when that is. I've heard it could be sometime in November. I heard that it might be in January when conference play starts. Like, I have no idea. But all I know is when he's on the floor, he's a serious game changer. And he's like the real reason why this team is finally going to have some championship upside. I didn't really see the championship upside last season just because the defense had its concerns. But Quaintance is a real game changer. As that, I don't know how much drop they're going to play. They could realistically do anything with him in the pick and roll game coverage wise. But, he had a 9.8% block rate last year, has a 7'5" wingspan, is just a freak athlete, can guard in space. He's a guy that I could trust guarding, maybe not against the most elite point guards, but I think he can guard pretty much any other type of player. And I would be just fine with that. I think he's going to be fantastic. They're probably going to ease him back into it, but overall, this is just an unbelievable defensive roster. I also think they're going to be a good defensive rebounding unit again. Mark Pope defenses have been top 35 nationally 6 straight years. And one final thing is like, this isn't typical of Mark Pope defenses, but I actually think there's some turnover forcing upside with this roster, and they don't really have to try to force turnovers. It doesn't have to be driven by a scheme. But there are so many plus playmakers on this roster who are also coming from non-aggressive schemes. So that's kind of the indicator I look for, is like, if you're a true playmaker and you can do it in a scheme that doesn't force a high level of turnovers or steals, it's definitely something that translates for me. Like Oweh here last year, 3.1% steal rate, Garrison 2.7% as a returner, and Colin Chandler 3.6% coming off the bench. But then you have other guys like Lowe, 3%. Diabate led Alabama with a 3.1% steal rate on the 349th ranked turnover forcing defense. And then Jaden Quayton's at the 5, 2.2%. That's plus for a 5. So these guys just, there's a lot of different things that they're going to be able to do. You know, I would assume the scheme is going to be very similar to past Mark Pope teams, but they're just going to do it at an elite level.
Yeah, that was one thing I had jotted down, was just they should be better in this area, turnover forcing. Last year they were 338th. I think there are playmakers on this side that certainly increase that potential. However, I think with Quaintance out, I do think that they aren't as improved in forcing turnovers, just because I think they're going to have to guard things differently, as you alluded to, especially when it's like Garrison or Moreno at the 5, in ball screen coverage. I think they're going to play it probably a little bit more conservatively, not force as many turnovers there. But I think once Jaden Quaintance is back, I think, they can really take a big leap in terms of turnover forcing on this end, because like you were saying, he has the ability to switch, to really, to come up and hard hedge, to do a lot of different things, because he has that mobility. And I think maybe the same for Diabate when if they play him minutes at the 5, he's only 6'7", but I think early in the year we may see some lineups with him at the 5, just because of, what he can provide there. But no, I mean, I think, like you said, this defense is going to be really good, especially once Quaintance is back, once Lowe is back, his ability to create plays and guard on the perimeter. It's really too bad that we're not going to get a full season of this team healthy, because I think it would be, a surefire top 5 team, and they still might be, but I think for the entire season. So, one thing I noted was, like, without Jaden Quaintance, the rim protection is a little bit up in the air, at least from a depth perspective. Like you mentioned, Diabate, not like an elite rim protector. He's a really good defender, but 3.8% block rate last year. Then you look at like Garrison, he's not a fantastic rim protector, 3.7% last year. Malachi Moreno, I don't really know what to expect from him in terms of role. And I wasn't super high on the tape in terms of what he could be as a rim protector. Yes, he's 7 feet, so you can't really teach that. But to me, it didn't really look like he was going to be like a plus rim protector, despite being 7 feet. So I think that's like my main concern is, until Quaintance is back, what is the rim protection going to look like? And then just once he is back, I'm not so sure about the depth of the rim protection. I think there's a lot there. I think Diabate is a fine, like, second rim protector for sure. But, then for me, I'm looking at now, like, discipline stats. So, like, Mo Diabate, yes, he's fantastic, right, as a defender, but in 2 years, he's a career 6 fouls per 40, right? So now he's going to play a bigger role, right? In his 2 years, he's only played 8 minutes and then 16 minutes. Last year in 16 minutes, averaged 2.5 fouls a game. So that's an area to monitor, especially early in the year for me with Quaintance out. Can he be disciplined? Because I think they're going to need his rim protection ability, compared to what they have in the rest of the front court group. And then Garrison's a 4.8 fouls per 40 guy. So, I mean, not great, but also not horrible, but he's just not a fantastic rim protector. So I think like for me, it's a lot of early season concerns, but I think once Quaintance is back, a lot of those kind of subside just because of what he brings to the table on the defensive end.
For sure, those are all fair, and I am excited to see if Mo Diabate is going to play it all at the five, because I think that would be very interesting for the offensive end as well, because I think he's their ideal, front court operator with the ball in his hands, being able to make decisions at the top of the key as that dribble handoff trigger man. So, but from a defensive perspective, yeah, there are a little bit more concerns, especially with Quaintance not being available, most likely to start the season. Like, I'm not super high on Garrison as a drop big in the scheme consistently. He kind of proved last year that he was just going to be a platoon guy, and I think that's probably how it shakes out with Garrison and Moreno to start the year, as more of a split. Maybe Garrison gets 25, Moreno gets 15, but overall, I think you'd have to consider the rim protection a downgrade. But I do like that the point of attack defense is going to be so good that they can kind of help mask that to an extent, and they have like Diabate and Williams off of the wings that can help out with the rim protection stuff. So ultimately, yeah, it's certainly a worse defense without Quaintance. I think they're closer to like maybe 20th in the country defensively, maybe 15th. But when Quaintance is available, I think this is a top 5 defense. It's certainly like, I think it's a top 3 roster, and I think Mark Pope is a smart enough coach to where he can get this defense to stay in the top 5 for the entire year. I know he hasn't had great defenses throughout his entire career. I think his best defense was 1 year at BYU. He finished 35th, but this is a different roster. This is a different type of talent and athleticism. So ultimately, I think they'll be just fine. He's pretty analytically sound, like values getting back in transition, makes the other team's shot diet rather poor, filters a lot of teams to the mid-range. He'll run you off the 3-point line. It was just a little bit limited last year with his roster, had to do some different things, had to play more of a shell. But I think this roster from the top to the bottom is pretty good. I mean, the bench unit, not as great as the top 6 or 7 guys, but I think they're going to be just fine.
Yeah. No, I agree. But shifting to team MVP, team X Factor, who'd you go with here?
I went with Otega Oweh for my MVP. He proved that he's probably going to be the number 1 scoring option in this system. He proved that last season, averaged 16 a game. Not like you mentioned, like not a fantastic playmaker, but I don't really think he has to be here. I think he's continued to grow his offensive game every year. I remember watching him at Oklahoma in his early years, and like you could see the defense was there, and like the traits and explosiveness was there, but he's continued to put it together more and more every single year, and he's turned himself into a 3-level scorer as well. I know he doesn't like to shoot it from the perimeter all that much, but he's so explosive, and he's got a good enough handle to where he's going to be just fine at the rim. So yeah, Oweh is definitely my MVP. He's also a phenomenal 2-way player. And my X factor is Jaden Quaintance. It's just a matter of, when he comes back, what's his role going to look like? And, like I mentioned, like when he's on the floor as that 5-man, I do think this team has true championship upside because of the defensive presence that he brings. It's really just the final piece to a Mark Pope roster construction. He's always been able to coach offense. He's always had very good offense. He had great offenses at BYU. This offense obviously has some things to shake out, but it's a great roster, and I think Quaintance is the final piece of putting everything together on the defensive side.
Yeah, I pretty much went with the same. I had Otega Oweh as my MVP as well for a lot of the same reasons. We saw him last year be, he just was kind of a gamer, in my opinion. Like we saw that game, at Oklahoma, going back to where he came from previously, and I think he scored like the last 16 down the stretch to win that game for them. Average 16 a game, as you said. He's really just a dynamic player on both ends of the floor. So I'm excited to watch him take that leap this year. And then for my X factor, I went with the health of Jalen Lowe and Jaden Quaintance so that they can reach their ceiling. Because I think with those 2 guys, their ceiling, like you alluded to, is winning the national championship. It has that kind of upside. Lowe hurt his shoulder last week, and we saw last year with Lamont Butler. He was he only missed 8 games, but he was really limited by it the whole season. So something to monitor, I think, how that kind of shakes out. It sounds like Mark Pope is pretty optimistic about it, but still something to take note of. And then Jaden Quaintance, once he can get back, how do they go about easing him back in? What does that look like? So I think those are going to be two really important things to keep an eye on as they get closer to March and set up for hopefully a deep tournament run. But that leads us into ceiling and floor. Ceiling and floor for the Kentucky Wildcats. Where'd you put them at?
Yeah, I mean, we've alluded to it a few times, but this team in its final form, I think, can be one of the best teams in the country. I think they can win an SEC championship. Their schedule is pretty tough. I was looking through some of the SEC schedules earlier today. They didn't get a great break in that regard. So I don't know how likely it is that they win a regular season championship. I know they're a really good team, but ultimately, I don't think that's really the goal for them. The goal for them is to win a national championship, and I think that's definitely in the cards for this team. This roster is too good. I think it's way too good to fail. I do think their floor is maybe fifth in the SEC. I think it'll depend on how Lowe and Quaintance are coming back from injury, when they decide to bring those guys back, and it might take them a little bit of time to get worked into the rotation and feel comfortable around all of these other guys. And the offensive small concerns that we mentioned, I think maybe come to fruition if there's not enough spacing, especially with the guys at the top of the roster. But ultimately, I think their floor is fifth in the SEC, like a 5 seed, and I still think they can get through the first weekend, just because I think this roster is going to be, and I think this team's going to be pretty well put together by the end of the season.
Yeah, I would agree. I think at their ceiling, as I've said, they could win it all. They can win the SEC. At their floor, I had them at fifth as well. I think to me, there's just no way they fall below that, looking at this roster compared to the rest of the SEC. I think even though they have a difficult schedule, I just don't think there's an avenue for them to fall that low. And like you said, even if they do, I think they're well coached enough, they're talented enough on both ends of the floor where they should certainly make it past the first weekend. I think Sweet 16 is kind of their floor with this roster. Mark Pope's done a great job building it and making it a little bit more balanced. But before we wrap things up, bold prediction here. I'll go first, I guess. I went with a Jalen Lowe stat. I said that he can average 6+ assists on this team. I think looking at it, as you talked about, not having an Amari Williams type player to kind of run actions through. Lowe already averaged 5.5 last year at Pittsburgh. There's not a ton of other on-ball creation for other guys on this roster. So I think, he's going to have the opportunity to really be the table setter for this offense and set a lot of guys up for success. And I think he's really good at that. Does a really great job organizing the offense. And I think we're gonna see that. So I think 6 is attainable.
Yeah, he's going to be playing in a faster paced offense too. And, if he has the ball in his hands, he could get some extra assists in transition as well. For me, I went with just a full team related outlook. I think they're a top 10 offense and top 10 defense at season's end. And I think this team is in the Final Four, and their ceiling is obviously a national championship. And if I was getting all of these players healthy and I knew what Lowe was going to look like, and I knew what Quaintance's role was going to look like for the entire season, if I knew that right now, I would say this is my pick to win the national championship. But I can't go out there and say that right now. Ultimately, I think those guys get healthy and they're going to be completely fine. And I would definitely say that they're my title pick. But for now, I'll be conservative and say that they go to a Final Four.
Yeah. We'll see what happens. High hopes for the Kentucky Wildcats for this upcoming season, but we'll wrap things up here with our final SEC team preview, and we'll see you next time on the Mainly Hoops podcast.